Hey, this is Henning Pizunker. I'm an associate professor at INSEAD, and it's with great pleasure today that we welcome Scott Page today. Scott, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining. We start right on the minute today. We might still have a few people kind of signing up, but we already have a nice audience. So why don't we get started? John, thank you so much. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're currently at the Collective Intelligence conference in Boston, so this is actually early for you. So you're taking time out of your morning. In the kind of pre-conversation, I saw a big coffee cup. So thank you so much for actually taking the time. Scott, for those of you in the audience who do not yet know you, you are the John Seeley Brown Distinguished University Professor at the University of Michigan. For those of you who don't know, it's first of all not easy to get tenure. It's super difficult to become a chaired professor. To become a distinguished university professor is a completely different league. I don't know how many there are at Michigan, but this is typically a very rare title to get. To give people like a feeling maybe for the kind of research you do. Scott is to a certain degree somebody who's a little bit like across disciplines, I would say, right? So in a certain way, you're really speaking to these different audiences. And you see, this is something that many people would like to do. In your case, people actually listen. Most economists don't like if non-economists actually talk to them, and sociologists are also not particularly eager. I would also say that biologists are not waiting there to say, like, let me hear from somebody outside of discipline. In your case, that's very different. I know quite a few scholars personally who have actually come to me when I was a grad student. In my case, this was my advisor at Stanford, Kathy Eisenhardt, who said, like, read Scott Page. And I believe Kathy Eisenhardt is one of the top 3 most cited scholars in business, to kind of give a feeling. And so you're very much kind of a scholar in that sense. You have been at Michigan pretty much all your life. I think there have been some exceptions to that. You and I, we share the same thing. We have an alma mater where it's very easy to find out where we went to. We simply tell people, if you went to Michigan or Stanford, don't worry how you find it out. You will tell, people will tell you.
That's right.
Otherwise, Scott has as one other kind of feature in his life on his CV, which is rather spectacular for people who know this field a little bit. He's a permanent faculty member, external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute. And this is an absolutely amazing institution where researchers from all kinds of disciplines come together, most only temporarily. And if you actually go back and think about, like, I think Brian Arthur was there quite a bit for quite a while. You actually use some of his models. Woody Powell has, for example, often gone there. It's really like where, big ideas get kind of developed, get tested early on. It's a very kind of special atmosphere, I like to say, and I'm saying this basically obviously from hearsay, maybe like, I think maybe to a certain degree comparable a little bit to the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, or the Center for Advanced for Caspers at Stanford, like where you really get like people from different disciplines together. So Scott, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to talk about your book, the Model Thinker. I've read the book. I read the book when it came out. It had a huge impact on me. I already complained to Scott. I wish the book would have been published earlier. I would have benefited enormously from this. I felt I had to take, in a certain way, the book brings all kinds of things together. So where I had to take like classes in microeconomics to learn about these things, and I had classes to take in sociology and classes in political science and statistics, the book brings all of this together, and it really helps you to overcome a little bit kind of silo-based thinking, where you would say like, oh, this is statistics, oh, and this is actually political science, and this is a business. It really says like, you know what, at the end of the day, these are all models which are basically there to explain complex system, social dynamics. And we should actually bring these together to understand the strengths and weaknesses. I had great fun reading the book. I found it incredibly helpful. I find what the book succeeds, it's a little bit, you see, like when you develop a game, The kind of great hallmark of a great game, it's always easy to learn and difficult to master. And the book felt a bit to me like that. You can read the book for the first time, it's like, oh, this is very intuitive, it's actually great fun. But then you actually, it's a book you go back to, you read it a second time, you read it a third time, and you say like, now I want to understand the mathematics. The mathematics, there are some mathematics in the book. I didn't find them annoying at all. I didn't find them like, I chatted with people who don't have a research background. And they said like, no, it didn't bother us. You didn't need it. You could just read through the book. But if you actually wanted to go a little bit deeper, it's really helpful to actually understand. So Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for the book. Let's start out very generally. Why did you write the book? There's a beautiful kind of contextual story around the book.
Yeah, no, so, and first of all, thank you. And I want to give for the book, I want to give a huge shout out to INSEAD. So when my children were 13 and 14, we spent the year in Fontainebleau, and then I also spent some time in Singapore. So I went to both campuses and taught courses to just a fabulous sets of INSEAD students that were kind of like the second to last iteration of this book. And one of the things I really wanted this book to do was be useful to managers and policymakers. And as you know, INSEAD students know, it's kind of a more mature, sophisticated set of students than your typical undergraduate or even MBA students in the US. I mean, they tend to be, skew a tiny bit older. And those conversations were just super useful, incredibly useful to me. And so I can't thank the INSEAD community, not only the scholars, but especially just the students, in helping me just think about how do you present things like, one of the great ironies is in that class, I made the decision to include contagion models in the book, right? And then it would have been just a giant gap not to have, given the opioid crisis, then even the opioid crisis, given the COVID crisis, we had two major events in the United States and COVID was worldwide, where these contagion models were just incredibly important to just kind of understand what was going on. Why did I write this? Quite simply, Jim March, who you knew well at Stanford, and his student Michael Cohen, who's at Michigan, Jim and March had written this book called, Mathematical Models for the Social Sciences with Charles Lave. And that book was about 40 years old. And Michael Cohen came up to me one day and said that book and that course needed me. He just stopped me and said, it needs you. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, no, it needs you. And that was kind of an odd comment. But what he was really saying is that it needed to be updated. There was all sorts of things, all sorts of other models that needed to be done. In particular, game theory hadn't really been a thing. It was just kind of being figured out when that book was written. And just to, talking about why I think this book is so important, especially for this audience, is that, I was talking at an event one time with Bill Gates, and Bill Gates is saying, like, the first thing you want to ask is this zero sum or is this positive sum, right? You always want to ask yourself when you get in any situation, that's the first thing. And that's, and that's kind of a foundational thing in game theory, like positive sum, zero sum, whatever, right? And then you suddenly think, how important is that frame? It's incredibly important. And in the last, 6 months, like many people, I've been in a lot of conversations about the use of AI. In fact, yesterday I was talking to someone from JP Morgan about AI, and they were like, yeah, one of the things we're trying to figure out, when are we in a zero-sum situation? And that becomes something else I talk about in the book, like a red queen game, where if you and I are in a zero-sum game, we're just constantly competing. I've just got to outrun you all the time, right? And you're trying to outrun me, and we're just wasting resources, and the pie isn't getting any bigger, versus a game that can be positive sum and expanding, where we're using AI to grow an industry, grow a market, make everyone better off. And just having that simple frame is really useful. So one of the things I wanted to do in the book is really embrace what Ariel Rubinstein, who's a famous game theorist, talks about. You can think of models as stories, as narratives, but they're narratives with logical structures that are coherent. And people learn by stories, we remember by stories, and that sort of thing. But a model is kind of a story, and the story's logically consistent. That's really helpful. So let me give one other example that I think is super powerful. There's a class of models called Markov models. Now, when you teach this to undergrad, you have to say, there's one thing you see is that there's kind of a bias against Russian names. It makes people think this is really hard. So there's also Lyapunov functions. Like if they were called Susan functions or Carlos functions or the Dave model or something like that, or the Henning model, people go, oh, that sounds fun, right? But when you give it a Russian name, it was like, oh my gosh, this must be horribly hard. But a
I'm happy
Markov
to make
model,
my name available if we are looking for
that's right. We can change it the Scott and Henning simple model.
I totally buy it.
But the Markov model is, I can explain it in 45 seconds. You basically say there's a set of states, right? So I was at a conference at the Cleveland Fed last week, and someone had a Markov model of opioids. So one state could be like you're not in pain. Another state could be you're in pain and you're using opioids correctly. Another state could be you're abusing, and a fourth state could be you're addicting. So there's just 4 states, fixed states, and then there's a function. There's kind of a probability of moving between states. And so if you have fixed states and fixed probabilities of moving between states, if those aren't changing, and then one other assumption, you can get from any state to any other state. That's it. So fixed states, fixed probabilities of moving between the states, there's some way to get from one state to the other state. Then the theorem says, the Markov, or something called the ergodic theorem, says that that system has a unique equilibrium. It's always going to go to the same place. So what does that mean? That's incredibly important, because if you think, oh, let's just intervene, right? Well, it's only going to have short-term impact. It's just like a vortex pulling you down to the same thing. And so what it tells you is moving the state does you no good, but changing the transition probabilities will change the equilibrium. So this is a deep, deep insight from a managerial perspective. Like, let's even take something like organizational culture. You may just find like, wow, we just keep going into this kind of like dark space, or this keeps happening. And then you keep kind of intervening, like, okay, let's have everybody say something positive or something, or let's do this new thing. But you keep finding your system just going back to the same place every time. Just changing the state by having like everybody, airing their grievances or something doesn't change the fundamental process. And you always go back, right, to the exact same equilibrium. And so that it's a very, very deep insight that comes from a very, very, simple model. Another one I think that's like super fun is like, and this came up actually twice yesterday at this conference I'm at, are these, bandit models, right? So bandit model is, they're called 2-arm bandit models, like a casino. Like, this is the foundation of A/B testing, in the tech space, where, I pull lever 1 and I get some sort of payoff, and I pull lever 2 and I get some sort of payoff, and I've got to decide which of these, should I pull. And it turns out, even though it's a very simple model, that it's impossible to solve under at best you can have a heuristic. And this is one of the things that people were talking about at this conference yesterday in the context of artificial intelligence. Imagine like, you and I come to work and we have 20 tasks that we do, and each of those tasks has a probability we have to do them, and each has some value to the organization in which we work. And what all of us are doing with AI right now is we're like pulling the like Scott lever. How does Scott do on this? And the AI level, how does AI do on this? And if AI is better than me, I let AI do it. So for example, since AI came out, I have not done a single, like I write in Python, I haven't done a single graphic. I just say to AI, I just type in, write, code for me for the graphics for this program. And I've just handed that task over, because when I pulled the Python lever, the AI lever on that, it's just better than me. But what's really fascinating though with this model though, then you think like, wait a minute though, when I pull the lever, I'm making an assumption that my ability and AI's ability are static. And one of the things that the core theme of the book is kind of to be a many model thinker. What you want to do is add on to the Markov model, or add on to the Bandit model, a learning model. Because then the question you want to ask, you say, right now, I'm still better than AI, but I haven't learned how to prompt correctly. So maybe I should keep pulling the AI thing and I'll get a little better, because I've been doing this for 15 years or something, and I'm just learning how to do it with AI. So maybe I should give it a chance to try and get better than me, right? But when do you make the decision to just abandon, one option, like yourself or the AI? You can, the book has some like, here's a heuristic you could follow. And one nice thing about these simple sort of like logical narratives is that they give you insights you wouldn't expect. So for example, in the case of the Markov process, it was that, change the probability of moving between states, that's useful. Changing the states, not useful. In the case of the Bandit problem, the deep insight there, which is really surprising, is you don't want to pull the arm that's going to give you the highest payoff. You want to give you the arm that's going to give you the combination of the highest payoff plus information, right? Because like, if I just pulled a Scott arm and I've been like, editing paragraphs for whatever the task is for 100 years, I get the payoff, but I don't learn anything. When I pull the AI arm, maybe I get a slightly lower payoff, but I learn a lot about the ability of the AI and about the distribution of the AI's abilities. And so very simple model of, oh yeah, we're pulling arms on bandits, gives you this really deep insight that, wait, I have to not think just payoff, I have to think of value of the act plus value of information in the long run is, the thing that really matters. There's also a lot of fun stuff that like, I get like wonderful emails from people that will say things like one of the things in this book is the diversity prediction theorem, which is in another book of mine, which basically says if you have a group of people forecasting, the crowd error equals the average error minus the diversity in the crowd. And that actually ends up being kind of a trope for the entire book for the use of many models, because any model, any approach on a complex problem is going to be wrong. All models are wrong. That's kind of an opening theme of the book. But if I have a collection of models and they're wrong in different ways, that collection is actually going to be really good at solving problems, making predictions, because they're diverse. And we think of people as being diverse, but models are also diverse. So if you say, I'm going to think of this like a Markov problem, I'm going to think of this like a learning problem, I'm going to think of this like a game theorist, I'm going to think of this like an equilibrium model from economics. All those different frames on things are going to give you like different sorts of insights and just make you a better manager. It's just going to make you a better thinker, leader, strategizer about like, what are the set of alternatives here? It's just going to, I think it rids you of, a lot of blind spots. Let me give one more example and then we can kind of, go to another question. But
one question, Scott, let me interrupt because Nikita just asked, could you please repeat that phrase about crowd decision? So maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you have, let's suppose I have a set of people making, and actually there were 4 talks on this yesterday at Collective Intelligence. Let's suppose we have a set of people making either a decision or a prediction. And now you want to ask, how accurate are going to be? So let's first do the prediction case. So we're all trying to guess, what's the price of this stock going to be, or what's the value of this market going to be? And so if we all have different models that we're using to predict, you can prove the following: the average of our prediction, how accurate that's going to be, is equal to kind of like the average accuracy of our models. That's what you'd think, but it's actually better than that. You can add into that, you're going to be even more accurate the more diverse your models are, the more diverse your predictions are. And the reason why is some are going to be high, some are going to be low, and that diversity actually helps you out. So if you and I think the same way, if you're off by 5 and I'm off by 5, the group of us is off by 5. But if you and I think different ways, if you're off by 5 and I'm off by 5, it could be that you're high and I'm low, and then we're going to get it exactly right. Right? But if we're thinking the same way, there's no way that you're high and I'm low. We're either both going to be high or both going to be low. Now let's take this to the decision context. And this is actually some new work that Lu Hong and I just published last month. Those were making a business decision. And you have 7 people in the room, and it's a 4-3 vote. Now you could think, okay, this was a hard decision. It's a 4-3 vote. You could think we probably did okay here because we had a lot of diversity in the room. It turns out that disagreement kind of loosely correlates with success, but model diversity correlates pretty strongly with success. If it was a 4-3 vote, but I knew that those 7 people were all using very different models, or if it's a 5-2 vote, and I know that the way that people were thinking was very, very different, you're almost, you can be pretty confident that you just did a lot better, right, than just based on disagreement, because disagreement could also reflect people just not having thought about it very hard, right? So let me give an example that I was doing for fun yesterday, but talking about someone from the United Nations about this. Take like the UN sustainability goals, right? There's 17 of those. And suppose we're trying to predict like what's the effect of these particular, changes on these dimensions to some other dimension? And let's suppose I just randomly construct a bunch of models, and I draw from them and make these predictions. Well, if I look at, if I just look at kind of like the vote and say, well, okay, it was 4-3, 5-2, maybe they did okay, maybe they didn't. But if I first sort of say, wait, are all the models different? Right, and restrict myself to cases where all the models were different, it turns out I do a lot better. And so what you get from them, so okay, you think, okay, wow, this is this like weird complexity guy from Michigan and Santa Fe talking about models, but where does this play out? Where this plays out is when you're having a meeting, you don't want to vote on just the raw vote. You want to vote on models. So you could have a room that decides something 4-3, but if the 4 are all using the same model, and so all using model A, and model A is basically saying yes, but then the other 3 are using 3 different models that all say no. The person vote is 4-3, 4. The model vote is 3-1 against.
It's interesting what you said, right? When you said like, hey, you go for diversity in people, but you also want to go diversity in models. To a certain degree, right? When we go for diversity in people, we do this somewhat implicitly, right? But it's obviously not necessarily correlated. Scott, let me.
So let's chew on that, because this is a really fascinating point, right? I think you just nailed it. When I think about how do I populate my team, who do I hire, everyone recognizes we're facing complex problems, so we want diversity. But this surface level diversity versus kind of like model diversity, cognitive structure, like how do I think about things? That's why how do you think about it? I guess I see this as like a really core question for putting together great teams.
You see, Scott, one thing I've always found interesting about this, I say 2 things about this. There's the late, I'm blanking on the first name, Kate Phillips at Columbia, and she always pointed out, she had this great paper, that people actually don't like being in diverse teams, even
no, that's right. Yeah.
They're higher performing. So
right.
Even if they're high performing, they perceive them as lower performing. The other thing about it is, you see, like in our profession, right, peer review is obviously very important. Right. And I always hear this complaint like, oh, the reviewers are not correlated. But the key thing is reviewers shouldn't be correlated, right? That's kind of a good editor actually basically kind of uses 3 reviewers who use completely different models, so to speak, to approach a paper, right? So I think, look, Scott, you really want to go for diversity in models, right?
Right.
I think at the same time, it's hard if you kind of take into account like strong cultures, internal selection procedures, right? So to a certain degree, everything which makes you succeed internally does then actually reduce the diversity in models you might actually have. Yeah, so Scott, I want to make sure we onboard everyone here. When you say, like, you see, like, we are using the term model, and it's one of these frequently used terms in our profession.
Right.
And it sounds like a trivial question, but what is a model, Scott? What does it come? What is that for you? You talk quite a bit in the book about it.
Right. So I would say, let me quickly go back to the Kathy Phillips thing and then go back to this. So Kathy, I co-authored a book with Kathy, and that's one of my favorite studies, because she sent me that paper and I'm like, what are you doing? Because, there's a theorem, there's a mathematical theorem that has to be the case that the diverse crowd has to be better. So she ran this experiment and the diverse crowd wins. Like, of course, because they have to win. It's kind of like saying the hypotenuse has to be longer than either leg of a right triangle. And the brilliance of that paper is that then they asked people, how good did your group do? And in the homogeneous groups, people were like, we were great, because everybody thought just like me. And in the diverse groups, people were like, I don't know, we had these 2 idiots who outvoted me or something, right? And the lesson I took from that, and Kathy and I used to do a lot of presentations together, is we would say that, like, the only way the room is smarter than you is if it sometimes disagrees with you. Like, if your room isn't disagreeing with you sometimes, it can't be smarter than you. And yet, in high stakes decisions, it can be really hard. You're going to go home and be like, I can't believe that, like, they voted that way. But then you have to ask yourself a different question. When did I become all-knowing? Right? Steve Schwartzman, who's not a shrinking violet, right? He says, like, when he looks back at the financial decisions he made that were wrong, it's almost always when he went against the majority of the people advising him and his underlings, right? And so he said, as a result of doing a 360 on his own managerial decisions, he realized that he, not to necessarily go with the majority, but like if a whole bunch of different reasons are disagreeing with you, you have to disagree with them. So what is a model? So
I have a theory on Scott, which I find, which I like.
Go ahead.
About Steve Schwarzman. I was thinking a lot about John Doerr at Kleiner Perkins.
Yeah.
And so John Doerr was incredibly successful for a while, right? He got like Yahoo, he got Google, he basically got every Silicon Valley hit. And then Kleiner Perkins went through a phase where it was struggling a little bit. And what people sometimes share with me is that, like, you see, the problem is almost like before that, we had a democratic vote of models. People had different ways. And John was like just a very, very smart person,
right?
Who was a very, very strong force in these kind of debates. But the more status he gained, so in a funny way, you see, like, the more, if you're right, if you've been right repeatedly, you get so much high status that you don't need to engage in the debates anymore, which made you so good in the first place. So what you just said about Steve Schwarzman is a little bit like that, right?
Right.
You see, once you're a billionaire, people don't push basically back on your ideas all that much. And so the very diversity which made you strong and where you might have been good in putting a diverse team together, you undermine that by increasing your status to a certain degree.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that I think is also fascinating, you come into work for some firm and you think about things slightly differently and you realize, like, oh, the firm's way is a little bit better than the way I think about it. If you then copy the firm's way, depending on what that is, you could end up losing the very diversity that you're kind of adding to the group. And, Brian Uzi has worked on this with Broadway shows and stuff, like, keeping the same team together can sometimes be problematic. But let's go back to your question about what is a model. And there's lots of ways to think about this. So a story is just kind of like, okay, here's an anecdote, right? Like in the case of the wisdom of crowds, with the people in the west of England getting Galton steer guessing the weight of the cow within a pound, right? But that's a freaking anecdote. You don't want to structure your firm around the fact that one time 100 years ago, people guessed the weight of a cow correctly, so let's rely on crowds. So what you want to do is you want to say, okay, what a model is going to make a set of like assumptions about, like, what are actors, what are signals, how do things go up? So in that case, you'd say, okay, a model of that is people make predictions and those are numerical values, and then we average those. Under what conditions would the crowd be better than kind of the best person? And when you write down that very simple model, you get something called the crowd beats the average model, which is that the crowd has to be smart. The crowd is always smarter than the average person, always. And the amount by which it's smarter is the diversity of the crowd. And then you realize, well, the kind of accuracy and diversity matter equally. And so I'm seeking, if it's really hard, there's a limit as to how accurate we can be. So I want to get accurate people who are diverse. Rather than being a trade-off between those, I kind of want both. In the case of like something like a Markov model, or a model of, let's suppose I'm looking at a model of consumers, right? You could sort of, instead of introducing a new product, you could, go back to these models and say, okay, well, maybe there's kind of, let's segment our consumers into types. There's going to be kind of like first adopters, early followers, late followers, whatever. And I think we're just even doing that, just even sort of saying, here's our types of consumers, and then you'd have one of these kind of contagion models. That would be one sort of approach, right? Another sort of model would be like kind of a SWOT model, right? Or a Porter 5-factor model, looking at things kind of like through a strategic lens, like who are our competitors, right? What are what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, those sorts of things. So all you're doing is you're trying to put a formal framework on it. And it can be at two levels. One could be just very abstract. I'm just drawing kind of boxes and arrows, just making sure that, like, seeing how the pieces all fit together. And then I can ask myself, what information do I need? Does this assumption really make sense? And even that can help clarify our thinking. And then there's a deeper level where what you do is you start saying, okay, let's try and do two things. Work through the math and think through the logical consequences of what these particular assumptions mean, or let's bring this to data and see how this plays out, right? So one of the things that let me go give an example from this paper at this person at the Fed in Cleveland, when, we have this opioid crisis in the United States, and when they said, okay, we're stopping these doctors from prescribing, tons of opioids to people, it turned out that was a bad decision because those people were already addicted. They were in the addicted box, and they weren't going to, by stopping them from getting opioids, they weren't going to leave the addicted box to responsible users. And so what that meant is they then went onto the black market, right, the illegal market, and started buying, opioids that have fentanyl in them. And one of the reasons we had so many deaths is because we were basically, didn't think through the implications of taking a set of people who'd lost self-control, right? And realizing that the market is the illegal market is going to respond, and then those people are actually really going to suffer. And a very simple model would have said, okay, we need to identify who those people are, because we know who they are, because they're the ones getting all these prescriptions, and figure out some pathway for them, as opposed to being very kind of like righteous, we're doing good by stopping, this kind of like over prescription. And again, this is the kind of many model approach, right? One thing would be to say, okay, we've got a crisis because it's overprescribed. Another model would be to say, let's look at the individual people, what categories they're in, and what's going to happen to those people. And this is, again, another reason why you also want diverse people, diverse models. Did the government, bring in people, and did businesses bring in people who were addicted to opioids and talk to them, or were overusers, and talk to them and ask them, what is your reasoning? How are you thinking? How much control do you have? And from that, try and build models. So I've become, the more I talk, one of the great learnings from the INSEAD students and also from business people is that, like, just the act of constructing a model and then going and talking to people in that space and being super inclusive of the people who are involved in that market, in that industry, and then thinking about, wow, here's my picture, even if it's boxes and arrows, of how this particular market works, or how this industry works, or what the consumers are like. Confronting reality with that and confronting other people with that is super useful.
Scott, so you've talked about the diversity of models across people.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the book, you talk also about the need for kind of, how should I say, internal diversity of models, right?
Yeah.
There's a paper I always like by Felipe Santos and Kathy Eisenhardt, where they basically take this idea on like organizational boundaries, which has very much been kind of dominated by transaction cost economics by Oliver Williamson. It says like, look, we should actually look at organizational boundaries through 4 lenses. And they say like, look, there's a transactional lens, there's an identity lens, right? For example, so let's say you are a car manufacturer. Can BMW really afford not to build its own engines? Right, even if you say like, even if there's a transactional logic where it might make sense, you can't. So I would like to push a little bit, and I start leading, like Julian and Matthew have like 2 questions on this, which I come to in a minute. But why the need for like multiple models? Why is it not that I can become like the expert on Porter's 5 force model, and then run the show with that?
Yeah, I think so. 2 reasons. One is that you can think of models as, coarsenings of reality, right? So in one extent, you're sort of, you're just coarsening things. And so because of that, you're lumping things together that could be different, right? And I think the other one, though, is you can almost think of it as kind of like a big map problem. So one thing you can do is if you type in like foresight obesity graph into, Google or some other search engine, you'll see that, England did this giant thing where they came up with all the causes of obesity. It's a giant map, right? There's all these things that filter in, and then it's color coded. And so it's kind of like, here's the ones that are kind of like economic. Here's the ones that are medical. Here's the ones that are sociological. Here's the ones that are just social. And so it really is, so if I looked at someone, that wasn't doing well, I can imagine kind of like asking, okay, well, let's think about how they're doing economically. Let's think about how they're doing physically. Let's think about how they're doing sociologically. Let's think about, how they're doing psychologically. Let's think about, what their network of friends like. And I think you can't eat the whole pizza, right? Like we don't have the kind of like if you look at that foresight obesity graph, or if you just think about all the dimensions of a firm or a person or an industry, you can't think about all of them at once. Right? It's just too big. And so one of the things that models are doing is disciplining you. Think of you having a certain level of cognitive bandwidth. Like we can only have a discussion that has a certain kind of like scope in terms of bandwidth. Otherwise, it's just too wide ranging and we're not focused and we can't understand what each other is saying. So what models are doing is giving us a common language, a focus, a structure, right? But it's like a particular lens that's both kind of not fully granular. It's some coarsening, but it's only looking at certain parts of it, And so, people talk about the parable of the elephant a lot, right, in this space, right, where, you look at the trunk, you look at the legs, you look at the tail, you look at the side, and you're seeing 4 different things. That's, that does ring true to an extent. Like if you're only using one model, you could be completely blind, right, to something else that's going on.
Julian asked the question, how do you then pick the right model? So if you have these different kind of models in your head, how do you then go and pick the right model, so to speak?
Yeah, Charlie Munger, who I quote, early in the book, he says, like he arrays his facts on a lattice of models, right? And so I think, one of the things you want to do is you want to have, in some sense, an ecology of models within your own head and within your organization, just ways of thinking about things. And then as the facts are coming in, right, you just want to say, I just don't think this is, kind of like the right way to think about this versus, no, I think we have to think about it in this way. Let me give a very specific example in terms of, what people would think of as like synergies or interdependencies, right? So economists tend to think of those as kind of like externalities, like it's an additive shock. Like a spark comes from a train and the field catches on fire, or doing this lowers this cost. Ecologists and systems theorists like John Sterman, who you're talking about, tend to think of these things that like actually have kind of more multiplicative effects or change the rates of flows and those sorts of things, right? And those are additive versus multiplicative is subtle, but it's actually really important kind of in the long run. But kind of the first approximation, you could just sort of say, oh, there seems to be an externality here. Well, then you could go one level deeper and say, should we be thinking of this as additive or should we be thinking of this as multiplicative? And you think, why does that matter? And the reason it matters is let's just take something as simple as force. Like, I have you have a young child, I have 2 now large men, but they very quickly figure out that like the bigger something is and the harder they throw it, the more damage it can do, whether it's to their house or the brother or the wall, whatever, right? And but it matters that it's force equals mass times acceleration and not force equals mass plus acceleration. Because if it's plus acceleration, you could increase either mass or acceleration and you're fine. But because times acceleration, you've got to do both, right, to actually get the effect. And you've kind of got to move them in parallel. So this is where, like, you kind of bring the models in, you have intuitions in, and then one of the reasons, like the book as a subtitle, how to make data work for you, is I never would have had that as a subtitle even 15 years ago, right? But now there's so much data, you can very quickly bring these models to data and figure out, is this additive? Is this multiplicative? And that's going to have, big implications for your strategy, because if a positive synergy is multiplicative, you want both of those things to go up, right? So if you find that, like, boy, we're testing this, and we're seeing that as we increase quality, right, we do better. But also as, if we increase, in addition to increasing quality, if we also are really targeting our advertising, both of those things seem to really matter. But the thing is that, like, if there's a synergy between those two, it matters whether that's kind of just a simple additive thing or whether there truly is a multiplicative synergy, because then you're going to want to, like, invest differently.
You have this beautiful example in the book which really kind of illustrates, I feel like you cannot just trust the data, or you need to understand the model that underlies data.
Oh, yeah.
You refer to this case of the Gates Foundation, how the Gates Foundation came to the conclusion that smaller classrooms work better. Can you maybe briefly kind of explain the model behind it and how they came to this wrong conclusion?
Yeah, so there's a fabulous paper called The World's Most Dangerous Equation, and it's the bell curve. And basically, it's that if you have a small sample, so let's take let's suppose I've got a bunch of franchises, and some of them have huge demand, right? And some are in large markets, some are in small markets, and like kind of who's doing best, who's punching above their weight. I'm going to find, wow, it's the ones in the small markets. Or if I look at high schools, in the case of the Gates Foundation, I'm like, okay, where are the very best high schools? Well, if I've got 2,000 students and I look at how they're doing on average, I'm getting the average of 2,000. And so the central limit theorem says the mean it's going to be a normal distribution. The mean of the average is going to be pretty tight. If I've got a school with 30 students, I might randomly get, right, I might randomly get, 15 students that were really, really good, right? And then I would think like, wow, we should go with, really small schools because really small schools are better. If you look at the worst schools, though, they're also going to be really small, right? Because you're going to randomly get a school where out of the 30 kids, 12 of them were underperformers. And so if you just sort of, and this is the problem with books like, I mean, not to pick on people, but like, the book Good to Great, right, which sold millions of copies about 20 years ago, it says, let's look at the really successful firms. This is a huge mistake. Let's look at really successful firms and then say, what attributes do they have? And let's copy those. Because the thing is, it could be that the firms at the other end of the distribution are doing those exact same things, right? And if you look at the people at the tails, you're going to have, in the case of the Gates Foundation, but just generally, you're more likely to be drawing things that are smaller, right? That have smaller samples because there's just this general regression to the mean on things when you draw larger and larger samples. And so it's a failure. The other example, the example I thought you were going to bring up, which is my favorite in the book, is Harry Parsh, a friend of mine colleague of mine at the University of Iowa, has this paper where if you run a regression on how many trees do people chop down as a function of how much they're paid, it goes in the exact wrong direction, right? The more you pay them, the fewer they cut down. The reason that's the case is the wage is being set based on how difficult it is to cut the trees down. And so if they're on a flat part of the forest and you're in Canada, where he was studying this, they don't pay very much because you can just basically walk down with your chainsaw and just chop them down. And so if the rate is really low, it's low because you can chop down a bunch. When they're on a steep, rocky slope, they pay you a lot per tree, but they don't chop down very many because it's hard to do. So if you just looked at the data, and this is why models are so important, if you just look at the data, so often, right, there's going to be strategic effects, bias effects, sample size effects, things like that, that lead you to the wrong conclusion. And so models are really good at disciplining inferences from data. In fact, that's the only way we can discipline our inferences from data.
Scott, there's a great question by Matthew Grimes, who's a professor at Judge Business School at Cambridge University, and here's a question which I really like in the sense of these models in many ways are kind of simplifying, right?
Yeah.
Then when we combine these different models, right, are we back to complexity? You see, like, is there a danger of like, hey, I'm creating like 5 simple models and these kind of show different things. How do I then make sure that I'm not back to like a complex kind of decision process in that sense?
I mean, I think so. First off, you kind of are, right? I mean, and the simple thing, I'm laughing because my younger son one time when he was like 11 or 12, someone asked him what his father did. It's like, we were at INSEAD, and he said, "My father says simple things to smart people."
Okay.
which is true, I think, right? I think that I absolutely agree with Matthew that like what you're doing is you're coping with a world that's incredibly complex. And this was one of the things with the people from the UN. If you think that instead of just trying to like reduce poverty, we now have 16 global goals with a 17th goal of coordinating on those 16 goals. How can I possibly play, whether you want to think of this as 16-dimensional ping pong or 16-dimensional chess, it's super complex. So what do you try and do? You try and kind of like parse it out and, again, coarsen and focus, but then also look at kind of the interstitial tissue between the areas on which you're focusing, the different parts of the elephant. And you want to kind of like constantly be pushing yourself to be able to absorb and comprehend and act strategically and competently through as complex of lens as you possibly can get. I think where Matthew's point is really profound here is that if you think of something like, Jürgen Habermas, who would talk about like, reaching consensus on something and the strength of the stronger argument, I'm sort of, with Elaine Landemore, I've written a paper sort of saying, yeah, we're kind of dubious about that because I think you're always going to have some cognitive dissensus when confronted with complexity. So go back to the example you brought, like in terms of what are the boundaries of the firm, it's really when you realize the boundaries of the firm are complex, right? And rather than just kind of say, wow, this is really complex and let's have an unstructured discussion about that, I think you're kind of better to kind of look at it through, the 4 lenses you were talking about and then sort of say, wow, okay, we now have a glimpse of the complexity of this. We see each of these lenses shone lights on different aspects of it. This one sort of seems more compelling than this other one, right? But a simple sort of Habermasian approach would be that, oh, after we look at these four things, we all understand the full thing and we reach consensus. But as Matthew's saying, no way, it's too complex, right? But I think we do gain something from trying to grope our way there, right? And we get part of the way there, I think, through the discipline of the simplification. So the simplifications discipline us, but then allow for conversations between them, and I think get us to deeper understandings. But the goal should be to try and understand the complexity, not avoid it.
What's your experience with Petra Slembeck asked a question which I learned is so you see, like, you've convinced us of the advantages of model-based thinking in that sense.
Yeah.
But how do you actually integrate this kind of thinking in like the rapid decision making in organizations, right? You see, like, I wondered if you ever follow up with it, right? You see, like, you go to organizations, you point out, look, this is where you should engage in model-based thinking. What has been your experience with, have companies then succeeded in implementing this? Does it fall by the wayside after a while? What has been your experience with this?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. So one of the things is, I think, let's go back to let's relate this to like Matthew's question, right? So suppose I'm like working, let me take the example of the intelligence community, which I know kind of reasonably well. Previous to sort of having a model-based approach, or this is also true of like the OMB, you might have said, okay, let's have 3 people think about this, right? But if you take a model-based approach, like you might just say, we have a committee of 3 people, our procedure is 3 people look at things, then we make a decision. If you actually sort of take seriously what I'm trying to put forward in this book, you might sort of say, okay, as we do almost a complexity triage or even a midstream complexity triage decision and say, this looks more complex than normal or less complex than normal. And if something's both complex and important, right, then what you want to do is kind of expand the set of models, right? So it's not the case many models all the time, right? I think the thing when I talk about sort of collective intelligence and good decisions and good protocols within firms, I think it's very costly, and both in terms of resources and time, to go at a problem with multiple models. However, this is how you're going to kind of like do better, win, gain market share, improve the world, is by recognizing when is something complex and high value. And when something is complex and high value, then you have to shift protocols. And your protocol has to be, it's no longer 3 people, right? And you can even now it's kind of fascinating. You can use AI to do things that I wouldn't have even imagined before. But I've talked to people who are now sort of saying, okay, we have 3 analysts look at something, and then we just put them through a semantic filter to ask how similar are these analyses. And if they're super similar, then you want to quickly ask, was this really simple? Because if it was really simple, then you think like, okay, yeah, this was a simple case, and maybe we have some insurance by using 3 people. But if our semantic analysis shows that these 3 are all over the map, I probably don't want to stop at those 3 then. I may want to have them have a conversation. I might want to bring in other people. But I've suddenly got this like really quick test of, I sometimes call this the entropy of reasons, right? How many, how much just kind of like uncertainty and diversity of reasons did we get? And the fact that I've suddenly got this indicated that was very, large relative to normal, that's a signal to me that I might want to then bring in more people or different people, but I only want to do that if it's important, right? So you want to somehow have this box of complexity and importance, right? We typically know the importance. Getting back to my other discussion, how do we know the complexity? Well, you know the complexity by, are the diverse models giving you different answers? I guess the other thing is you constantly want to be encouraging people to think about things in different ways, right? So I was talking, I can't name the company, but I was at a company that does large projects, and they were saying one of their big learnings over the last 60 years has been, you want to be mixing people together who've worked on different projects. Because if I've worked on, let's suppose I worked on building, the Airbus 300, I learned a whole bunch of very specific lessons from that, right? And frameworks. and you want to then link me with someone, you know, who's built Rolls-Royce airplane engines in England for 20 years, because they probably learned something very, very different, right? So even, and this isn't necessarily that I learned Markov models and you learn Bandit models, but maybe more like kind of like frameworks and kind of softer models, right? Or just things to be aware of.
There's to a certain degree, a lot of the questions we're talking about are implicitly about bias, but there are a few questions kind of explicitly about bias.
Yeah.
In the chat, going back to your earlier work, for example, Irving Sequoia asked the question, look, we know that people are unknowingly or unconsciously biased and will tend to be with, and will also kind of hang out with similar people. How do we kind of get over these kind of biases, Scott? What's kind of an effective way? A few of the things we've talked about touch up on this, but can you say something explicitly on like biases in all of this?
Yeah, I think this is where, so I want to think of bias as kind of like in three different boxes. So one is people think about bias in terms of like somebody having some sort of personal bias towards a particular, identity group or type of person or type of thing. Let's, set that one aside. There's a second bias, which we think of as kind of like statistical bias in terms of like, I just have a biased sample and sort of learn the other thing. There's a third thing though, which I think you're getting at, which is kind of like, in some sense, model bias, lens bias, framework bias, in the sense that there's dimensions that I don't even see, right? Or things that I don't even consider. And because of that, I'm going to have systematic errors. But there's a paradox here in the sense that like I've only got so much bandwidth. Like there's only so many things that I can think about. And so there's two ways to think about bias. I mean, how do you overcome that? One is you just want to make sure that you've got people in the room that are thinking about all of those things. So let's just take, as an example, let's take something like gender bias or environmental considerations, right? You could imagine someone just, sitting in a room and saying, if I've got a group of people, I could say to you, Henning, I want you to be, you have a lot of expertise on environmental considerations. And I'll call him out on this because I think he's just brilliant. Tim Geithner is just, read Secretary of the Treasury when Obama had to spend all that money really fast. And I've talked to people, I've met Tim a couple of times, I've talked to people who worked for him, and he would say to someone, look, we're going to be talking about Philadelphia. All any of us have ever done in Philadelphia is have Cuban food. You're from there, you went to Wharton, you grew up there, you spent 40 years of your life there. We're talking about spending $300 million there. I just want you in the room thinking about, wait, does this make sense for Philadelphia, right? So you actually can, when you're building your room, telling people, why are you at the meeting? What lens do I really, what expertise do you have? And I want you really laser focused or partially focused on like these sets of dimensions, right? And I honestly think people don't think strategically enough about who's in the room. There's, again, many lenses. Like I've got people in the room for political reasons. I've got people in the room for secession reasons. But you want to think about, do I have people in the room that are covering all the bases here? And are they aware of this is why they're in the room? And so what Geithner was brilliant at was telling people why they were in the room, right? So that they could prepare and that they were thinking, they had the mindset and the kind of the model set that he wanted them to have. Like he didn't want this young person from Philly in the room to talk about macro policy, right? He wanted them to be focusing on, is this actual thing making sense in Philly?
You see, I always find these, they're not many studies because they're kind of hard to do.
Yeah.
But I always find it interesting when you kind of look at the antecedents of something and the consequences and then see how they are not lined up. So you see, like if you write two papers in one, if you write a paper which is like who gets into the room and actually who creates value in the room, right? And you see, like the person who has been living in Philly on the ground for like 30 years in Fiddler Square and can basically tell you, hey, this money you blow on X is not going to work because there are these two traffic lights which will, and there's no parking, right? That person typically doesn't get into the room, right? So actually looking at these, how should I say, Jim would have said, like, look, you need to kind of tap into the local knowledge, right? the local knowledge in an odd way is very often not represented, right? It's almost like the whiz kids, right? Kind of planning the Vietnam War, basically, in offices in the... I wanted to ask you, you have been at business schools for a good chunk of your time. How do you feel, given the value that models create? Or in many ways, right, if we're thinking about MBAs, a big role of a manager is basically to make decisions. And so you really want them to think in terms of models. Do you feel that the current curriculum in the MBA, but you can also think beyond that, actually lends itself to kind of to educate model-based thinkers? You see, like I'm skeptical. You see, like I'm not sure if going through case study after case study actually kind of generates in the student's mind this like, oh, these are the different models, and now I can bring them to bear, so to speak. But I'm very curious in your perspective on, like, if we want to change education based upon everything you've said, how would you implement this beyond having Scott Page teaching a modeling class?
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is the thing I think everybody's struggling with right now in the case of, like, with AI, like, what is the role of the classroom, right? Because things have shifted under our feet, just like kind of the internet became a thing. It used to be you went to college because that's where, like, the journals were and the books were, and now all the information's available. And now there's also somebody who can kind of like give, answers to any questions you have. So there's a question of what should we be teaching? But I think that there's what AI is not going to do for you is say, okay, here's lenses through which you should look at particular things. So this is something, Kemp, yesterday at this meeting I'm at, like, here's just a very simple algebra. Suppose I have a meeting of 40 people that lasts an hour. What's the total content that gets produced in that? Well, maybe 35 minutes in a good situation, right? Because people are kind of like summarizing it. But now using AI, you can imagine there's a Polis was one thing, CrowdSmart was another. There's several companies that do this, where you can have everybody talk for 20 minutes simultaneously. So that's 70 times 20, that's 1,400 minutes of content, right? So that's 40 times what you can normally, and the AI can then instantaneously, using like semantic techniques, say, okay, here's a set of, here's the topics that seem to be most important to people. And then you can have a focused discussion on those topics. So you lose all this, you gain by not having all these status bias, path dependencies, all that sort of stuff. So let me go back to how your original question is. Like, I think about this, if someone's a manager, there's kind of three things they're doing. One is they're managing the day-to-day flow of information. So in a lot of meetings, like making sure information and resources are going kind of the right, places. Second thing they're doing is they're making hard, careful, strategic decisions that require planning, right? Third thing that they're often doing is responding to some sort of crisis, right? And that's kind of trying to make a quick decision, right? And I think when you think of then about, okay, what models should I have in mind for, first off, you should have this general model, and in a crisis decision and in a planning decision, I need a lot of diversity, right? But those are going to operate in different ways in the crisis versus the planning. There's going to be a deep engagement in the planning thing. In the crisis thing, I just want people that are waving flags saying, wait, from my lens, that's a really bad response, right? So you're hoping the diversity is preventing you from doing something bad. In the decision-making context, I think you're hoping for the diversity of models to help you go really deep. So what do we then teach students? I think one thing is we teach them to continue to be incredibly curious, but also I think teach them to have dialogue. I think this is one of the things that I'm finding, I think, super important, is how do we teach people to actually really engage in alternative ways of thinking? So in the case-based method, is they have a bunch of people kind of giving their take, right? I think we need to move towards how do we really teach people how to have productive dialogues across different framings and across different models.
Scott, it's almost in Fontainebleau, it's almost 3 p.m.
Which is time for coffee, right? I think it's like
Here we go. in Boston, it's in Boston where you are right now, it's 9 a.m. So
right.
You probably returned back to the conference. Thank you so much, Scott, for taking the time. Thank you so much to the participants. This is normally the occasion where I actually announce the next speaker. We do not have a next speaker yet, so there is nobody to announce right now. There's definitely going to be a little bit of a summer break. There's a little bit of a debate in how we're going to continue. For loyal listeners, they know this. I always end these talks with there are 400,000 thought leaders on LinkedIn, but just one Henning Pisunker. So you can actually follow me on LinkedIn, and I will make sure I'll keep you updated there over the for the next for the next seminars. Otherwise, Scott, thank you so much again. I highly recommend the book, The Model Thinker. It's available if you go on Amazon. You see it has accumulated rockstar reviews. I'm very optimistic to say it'll change your life if you read it, and it will do so for the better. Thank you so much. Scott, I hope to see you in the not too far future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.